Welcome to Vision Chats, where the only thing that matters is the future. I'm Farouk, Vice Provost at Johns Hopkins University, and I am excited to have a conversation today about the world of work around the world. And with me today to manage this conversation are Nicky Garcea, who is the co-founder of Cappfinity, Richard Abendan, who is a chief of party at RTI International and USA STRIDE in the Philippines, and David Bearfield, who is the head of HR, Human Resources in the United Nations. All three are joining us from different locations around the world. Nicky from the UK, Richard from the Philippines, and David from New York City. And we're excited to jump right in. There's been a lot that has happened, especially in the last 2 years. So I want to try to frame this conversation around how our world has transformed in the last 2 years. We know what has happened. A pandemic came upon us, and unfortunately, it has resulted in about 6 million deaths around the world. It has also resulted in a 500 million cases of COVID-19, but also we've seen the power of science, and as most recently reported, 10 billion vaccination doses have been administered around the world. We also know that our world has changed completely over the last 2 years. We went from a complete shutdown to trying to learn how to engage with this virus and with this pandemic. And we've seen industry sectors completely shut down and others thrive and grow, and others were born during this time. We've seen everything from education to commerce to entertainment gone virtual overnight, and we're all thankful for the technology to have been there. Perhaps we could have adopted it a lot sooner, but as I say in my circles, it took a pandemic to get us to be a lot more comfortable with that. And the world of work has changed. We've seen work change, and we've gotten more comfortable with doing work virtually, kind of like what we are doing today. The world has gone remote since then, and we're now starting to try to come to grips with that and how we work in the future. We know that according to some stats that have been published, 16% of companies are fully remote now worldwide. We know that 60%, 62% of workers around the world are doing some type of remote work in a hybrid function, either a couple of days a week or all the way to 100%. But we also know that 44% of companies and organizations will not allow their employees to work remotely. And LinkedIn recently reported that 181% increase, or that the number of job postings that are remote increased by 181% on LinkedIn in the last 2 years. I know for us here at Johns Hopkins, for the jobs that are posted for our students specifically, it has increased by 500% in the last 2 years. That we've seen a huge increase there, and in the last 5 years by 1,300%. So a major increase there. So is this a norm? Are we seeing a major shift, or was this just temporary? Of course, the changes in the world of work are not just about remote, hybrid, or in person, but there are a lot more about that, about efficiency, about outcomes, about how we do our work, about what's needed, what's acceptable. So I'd love to start us there with this conversation. Where are we today, and where are we headed, and what are you seeing from your vantage point around the world, and what's happening in different countries? So I'll start this off with you, Nicky, just sort of like at a 30,000 foot level. What are you seeing from your vantage point? And we'll go from there.
Thanks so much, Farouk, and thank you for including me in this truly international vision chat, although I think Richard deserves definitely something from all of us for being awake at 3 o'clock in the morning. So amazing, Richard. I think the piece that we're noting globally, and I think there are similarities certainly in the US and Europe, is the Great Resignation is definitely something that organizations are experiencing globally. My colleagues in Australia say maybe not to the velocity that we have seen it across certainly the US and Europe. There's also a piece that isn't just about resignation, that's also about realignment. So many organizations, you open talking about the kind of changes around tech, but at Cappfinity, we've got clients within aviation, within hospitality. They've radically rechanged and remodeled their businesses. So huge realignment in some sectors as well. And then globally in education, and I hope this isn't you, Farouk, but I hear people talk about the Great Migration, where people are really corporates are targeting educational institutions as a brilliant place to source talent. And so we have some people maybe moving out of the educational sector for the first time in their careers into new opportunities within the corporate sector. So there is certainly in the pandemic globally, and as a psychologist, a business psychologist, it's, you know, when you helicopter up, it's incredible that a pandemic has made so many people really think and consider and change and make changes because of what they've experienced. Now, some of those changes have been forced upon them. But for many, you know, they've taken themselves out of work. They've taken a moment of pause, and they have created movement. And I think it's definitely something that we've seen across the globe. And as a result, businesses are navigating a level of turnover and churn and a need to view talent pipelines, and in a way that they've never had to. They've got to source talent in new ways. They need to hopefully diversify. But it's certainly a moment of huge global change for workforces.
Mm. This is fascinating. I would love to explore a little bit more the Great Resignation impact, and certainly we have felt it in the United States. There are all sorts of reasons for it. People could because there were jobs and that were available here in the United States, but also I think there was some ties to the great purpose crisis, you know, that people in general have been reflecting about their purpose at work and in this life for years before the pandemic. And it really took an experience where people have seen death nearby, either because of sickness from COVID-19 or just from other causes, and decided that they wanted to take more risks, and they were able to. And we've seen just major changes, whether it's moving from out of state or from one location to another, relocation, also just changing industry sectors, as you said. I've also wondered how true that is around the world. Have we seen the Great Resignation movement happen around the different continents? What are your experiences? Either David or Richard or Nicky.
I think there's a strong element of that, you know, affecting everyone. I think what you've just said, Farouk, is I think very valid and quite profound, really, about the changes that are taking place. And I think my perspective is, if you see lots of things that have been swirling around for a while, and they come to a head with this protracted crisis that indeed has been long enough and severe enough to make people ask themselves some quite profound questions. Perhaps they had time at home to sit and think about those things, where before we're constantly in the hamster wheel of just producing, and suddenly all of those things stopped. People had more time on their hands, and I think what we see is, you know, changes of generation and changes of thought. If I look back to, you know, when I was at university, most people were interested is, you know, it's about advancement. What am I going to earn in particular? Status. And I think this next generation, with their attitudes about so many things, are already very radically different to Gen X, for example, where I'm from, you know. And now you see these things coming to pass, that people are then starting to question things in other generations, but the next generation coming up is already profoundly different. And I think this issue of purpose and meaning is really one that's very interesting. And I was talking to somebody in the private sector in HR recently about this, and who said, well, look, yeah, the great resignation is happening and they're all coming to you. And I think there's an element of that. We see, people looking to join our organization from all walks of life, including the private sector, and, people taking a cut in pay to do so, because of the sense of purpose. And, I think certainly, that's something that's global. And I think that the other trend now comes in, with a generation of digital natives who are now flooding into the workplace. It doesn't matter so much where they come from. I think that whole culture has been shaped by the internet and everything with it. And there's so many things, therefore, that are in common, whereas before may have been very isolated or different from region to region, country to country. There's a lot of shared experience and shared culture and values. So I think you see all of these things now coalescing, and I think if organizations are completely tone deaf to that or out of tune with it, then they're going to find themselves, I think, in a difficult position when it comes to attracting the talent they need to move forward.
Yeah, and I guess from a Philippine perspective, when you think about the purpose in life and the project we're doing in the Philippines, where we're working with career centers, and Farouk's working with us already on that. One thing to note from the Philippine context is that there's many Filipinos who are working abroad. And so all these impacts, even though you think it may be outside the Philippines, but it's really hitting a lot back home. And so in our career centers, one thing we saw in one of the tracer studies we looked at was that, I think a sizable percent of Filipino students were looking to work abroad, even when in college, surveyed early on, like their first job would be ideally abroad. And so they were working towards that goal. So I think we've seen that how like many Filipinos are into seafaring or service industries abroad. And that's all been sort of a lot impacted more in this industry more than others, right? And so I think those changes and shifts are sort of magnified back home here. At the same time, the job market isn't that great to begin with here early on. I mean, it's improving, but even before the pandemic, there are still some challenges, and I think those challenges still remain. Some of the core challenges of maybe employment back home, how do we increase services, or at least a better conditions for service jobs back in the Philippines or in probably other countries in the region, is something we still have to tackle. There are still some fundamental challenges we still have to face. Even that hasn't changed with the pandemic.
Very interesting. I've also wondered if the Great Resignation is a luxury of the privileged, whether it's privileged people or privileged neighborhoods or even privileged countries and regions around the world. Are there regions that around the world that have not really had the luxury to experience Great Resignation? That people can just quit jobs to start new jobs or to start new ventures, and to have sort of like a safety net that they can operate from? Or was this really a global phenomenon?
I'll start in that. I always hear this, the Great Resignation, the gig economy has been very enabling that. Sure, there are many Filipinos who are in the gig economy and who can sort of transition, actually work remotely and have foreign projects like while they're here. But it's not something you hear often. It's not, especially for local jobs. We don't see that where they're already having a hard time finding a job or keeping their jobs. But so I'll be surprised if it's a significant number here, and in terms of sort of that resignation wave going on.
I think just to chime in on that, I think countries where the lockdowns maybe have been longer, that the resignation, I don't think, has been as profound as we've seen in Europe and in the US. So I know the Philippines, Richard, you were saying, has been in a kind of more stringent lockdown than certainly the US and the UK. And so I think you've got an element of the economy prior to the pandemic, but also actually, if you are only now just coming out, then there will be a point where perhaps the reevaluation may happen in the Philippines. I don't know, Richard, you have to tell us in a few months' time, but certainly our colleagues in other countries where it's been kind of a more severe lockdown, we don't seem to see the same level of resignation. So there might be an element of luxury to what you're saying, Farouk. I also wonder, David, in sectors where certainly my early career talent data is suggesting that places like UNDP, certainly the National Health Service in the UK, are becoming very attractive as employers because of the purpose, because of the work. Have you seen that within the UN and also then I guess other agencies? Are people leaving or are they actually staying because of the work they're delivering?
We don't see huge numbers of people leaving in UNDP, and we see strong interest. And I think this issue of the Great Resignation, again, it's a great question. Is it an issue, a luxury phenomenon? I think for some, probably. I mean, obviously, the pandemic has hit the poorest hardest, and we see that, in UNDP in terms of our work. For the first time in decades, all of the indices have been going backwards sharply, and it's people who are, really were struggling before have been hit. So of course, if you're in that position, you're not in a luxury position of being able to necessarily, pick and choose. But I think beyond that, I think you could say resignation, look more widely, and say a lot of people maybe have lost their job. So it's kind of forced upon them to reevaluate. And then what do you do as part of that process? Or others who are just starting out and are making their choices, the fork in the road, where do they go? And I think all of these people are going to be heavily influenced, by the general tendency that we see right now. But certainly, in UNDP, yes, there's a lot of interest. I think purpose is what defines us as organizations, not just UNDP, but the whole UN system. And, we went out last year, interesting timing, with our first ever global graduate program. And we were targeting the 50 or so least represented countries in the world in our organization. And we wanted very diverse people, very, very specifically from within those countries. We got, we got 38,000 applications in days. And we had to shut down our marketing campaign almost before it got off the ground because we were absolutely overwhelmed with the storm of interest. And so you see that was from all the continents. So that's truly some kind of global evidence, and we were getting really good people. And when you look in the organization in response to our own global staff surveys, we see both very high levels of engagement and very high levels of pride in the organization. And I think that's again, people have been coping with really, tough conditions in already very, hardship countries. Then you add COVID on top of that for 2 years, and we don't see people running away. People are staying and delivering, and so I think that really speaks to that sense of purpose that really does, run right through our organization.
I guess,
Go ahead, Richard.
I think you've seen the statistic before. I forget the numbers in the morning here, but there's also a large underemployment component here. And I guess given that, like, there are many students who work in their first careers, basically not where their major is in college. And so in a way, they're forced, or the situation actually forced them to be in a sort of to pivot early on. Mm-hmm. How that early experience in pivoting or flexibility has helped them down the road. Something to think about, that may be an advantage down the road, that because of this disruption, hey, I've done that before. I'm in a field totally different. Like, you have people in the service industry who are engineers. And how does that work? How does that influence how adaptive the early generation, the new generations in employment is something of interest. I'm not sure how that would play out.
And that's fascinating, and I'm also wondering what will be the impact of inflation now and the rising cost of living that many nations are experiencing, and how that's going to potentially change this chase for purpose phenomenon too. this conversation is making me think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and how whenever I think of it, or I hear of a trend or a pattern of chasing purpose, I'm thinking, okay, that's a society or a group or a population or an area that's at the top of that pyramid, that's reaching self-actualization stage. And but when the cost of living changes and it becomes a lot more about putting food on the table, do we start to go back down that pyramid and start to really think about, okay, like the purpose of a job is to provide for one's family and for self, and provide food and shelter and security. So I wonder also, like, what's happening today, with inflation, with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, all of the things that are happening worldwide, if they're changing potentially these dynamics. And it makes me wonder if, David, you're going to continue to see those large numbers of people wanting to apply for your positions from different sectors and be willing to take those pay cuts.
I think that's the case for some, and for sure, for others, in countries where there's a lot of hardship, it's also an attractive prospect from a traditional employment perspective in terms of benefits and job security. And we've just overhauled our contract modalities for our project and program staff that make up most of our workforce to make them more attractive. So I suspect we definitely see some effects of that overall. Is that we're a very attractive employer from terms and conditions, but most importantly from a purpose and meaning perspective. But I agree. I mean, absolutely, not everyone by any means has the luxury of picking and choosing. But if you spin it on its head, you could say that for lots of employers, particularly ones that could in the past maybe sit there and say, well, we're offering lots of money, and suddenly offering lots of money isn't the winning proposition it used to be. And I think, and many organizations, I suspect, will say to themselves, how are we going to compete for the best people? Right? And I think in asking themselves that question, they're going to have to change the offer if they want to continue to get people. And that will perhaps change things in a much wider perspective, right? For what's the nature of this employment. So it's not only driven by what do individuals want. It's a marketplace, and that's influencing that demand and supply continuum. Feeds off each other. They feed off each other. So employers are going to have to be changing, and I see evidence of that. Speaking to colleagues in the profession, how do we pivot as an employer to be able to get the brightest and best people? And so just having a big salary isn't enough, and I think that will change also the work and the offer of work, which potentially then will simply spill over to all of the other people in organizations, because they will kind of benefit from that as well. So I think the changes are probably going to be more far-reaching, and when it comes to things like flexible working and other things, this is where suddenly it's not just something of a few privileged people, but it begins to become much more of a mass phenomenon that's also pushed from the top down, not just the bottom up.
Yeah, very good comment. Nicky or Richard, do you want to follow up on that?
Just something, I guess, short from me, which is we've been running a global survey for a number of years. And although purpose and meaning that we've all shared on here is key, salary hasn't gone away. So whilst in the last 12 months, there's been a much, much greater focus of candidates on organisations that have got strong DE&I policies that are actually operating and talking about diversity, equity and inclusion and treating their candidates well, salary has not dropped off the scale. So I think that we probably have to balance that reality of the Great Resignation, but the salary element, it's not solely, I think, just kind of purpose. I think salary is still part of this. I can see one of the things in the chat by Lisa, who's mentioning kind of the impact that inflation has on anyone with childcare responsibilities. Like, you could probably expand that into caring responsibilities. and what that means in terms of, particularly with childcare, the cost of living and the impact that inflation has. And to David's point, I think the organisations that want to retain and hopefully attract individuals who might come from all sorts of backgrounds, certainly could be working parents, I think they will have to really consider their offers and consider the level of flexibility that they're willing to provide. Whether they'll go as far as covering elements of childcare, but I definitely think the capacity to be able to support people more so that they're able to manage to work and manage to continue with their responsibilities is going to be a big part. And I do think that is starting to change. I see some of the large enterprise clients that I work with really drastically considering their flexibility offers to support certainly people with either working parents or caring responsibilities. Richard, I don't know if you want to chime in on Lisa's point.
Maybe I'll just sort of jump back to what Farouk mentioned about the concept of privilege, and it sort of magnifies the issue on mobility. It's always been a problem before, like how can a person go to another country and transfer qualifications, the whole migration barriers on visas. We have to still consider that. So the barriers are still there. They open and close variably. One classic example, I believe, was how the nurses are being hired in the UK. And with the pandemic, there was this issue about, hey, we're losing healthcare workers in the Philippines in this time of the pandemic. Should we limit the migration, at least on the export side? And on the UK side, I believe there was a strong demand. We wanted to bring in more. So mobility has always been a challenge, and I think we have to highlight that. It's not just us. It's part of the privilege question, right, Farouk? And I think there's more mobility opportunities in other countries, and that's something that sort of we have to just take note of. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So this brings a question about how companies can compete for talent, and then how talent can stand out in this big war for great opportunities and great talent. So I'd love to peel the layers a little bit more for those. I know we've talked a little bit about a couple of things that companies can do in order to win the great war of talent. What are other ways for companies and employers and organizations to attract and retain employees in this new era of post-pandemic in the next 10 years? How can employers compete and win?
I'm happy to kick this one off. First of all, I think one of the things I'm seeing across our clients is a willingness to view talent pipelines more broadly than they have before. Certainly trying to remove any criteria that doesn't necessarily predict talent in role. So if you take graduates or apprentices, do you really need academic thresholds? Something that we've been championing for years, but I'm seeing more and more people remove that from their criteria globally. I'm also seeing organizations consider whether they should do more to support individuals into the organization and maybe create foundation years almost. So the foundation year to become an accountant, a foundation year to develop a level of expertise, so that people who maybe don't have academic qualifications or career changes might be able to have more mobility, to borrow Richard's word, so that there could be more fluidity between jobs. And so that, quite frankly, your past, whether it be your education or your past experience, might not have to then dictate every single move you take within your career going forward. And before the pandemic, we were aware of the gig economy. We were aware that people would have multiple careers. And I think organizations are just starting to think actually breadth and maybe more creative ways to support transitions of all kinds is what will help them be an attractive employer, but actually get source talent that perhaps they've not looked at before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this your conversation about criteria reminded me of a thought that I've had recently as I've experienced some search committees in higher education. So I'm going to let you in a little bit into our process within higher education of how we hire people. And in my last 2 decades in higher ed, I've sat in multiple search committees. And it has fascinated me how all these search committees that look for candidates to fill different roles, especially in executive roles, they're looking for almost everything except for the skills that are necessary to do the job and the desired outcomes. It's fascinating, the conversations that happen when we look at different resumes and cover letters and applications, that the people who are around that committee who are looking at these things are looking for a story, for a profile, for how the candidate comes off, for traits and qualities. And I think we miss the most important part of that search, which is what are the top skills that are necessary to get this job done, and what evidence do we have in this person's materials that tells us that this person is going to accomplish the desired outcomes, which frankly, a lot of times we don't even know. So it made me wonder if that is true elsewhere too. Like, do you see that in your sectors too? Do you see that in other sectors? That is that one of the reasons why we tend to see this mismatch of candidates and jobs? Is that great candidates apply for jobs and never get called, and others get called and end up getting hired, and then they end up either failing or leaving soon afterwards. And I wonder how much of that is just is due to the mistakes that we have in our own processes of hiring people. What thoughts does that trigger for you?
Well, that triggers many for me if I jump in, not because of just the job I've been doing now, but before that, coming here, I was head of recruitment for the European Union institutions for 11 years. So I have been very deeply involved in recruiting. And I think if we turn the clock back, it was actually McKinsey back in '98 who coined the phrase "the war for talent." And that's really just been thrown into such sharp focus. And I think you've said a lot of great things there in those comments. Lots of recruitment has been, you could call it kind of complacent. There are other words you could use, but basically just to go and look for the usual suspects, a few top ranked universities, and pay huge amounts of attention to people's paper qualification, what they've studied, where they've studied it, what was the grade, but actually missing all hugely important things and hugely important parts of the population that haven't had to bother. And I think now, again, another consequence of what we're seeing from the pandemic, the great resignation, all of these things, is that employers won't be able to simply rely on those things that they used to. So we're just going to go and look at this university, this one and this one, because they're top ranked, and ignore all of the others and ignore other people with other skills. So that's where firstly this DEI is really so important, that actually diversity trumps talent any day. You want diversity in your organization, and even better if it's talented diversity. But to have that different people who bother to go out and reach people with different skills, people who are, for example, neurodivergent, and there's an awful lot of people that lots of employers just didn't bother because they're just complacent. We can just get the people we think are great. Are they the right people for the organization? And that's the real question you just asked there, Farouk. And why do people come and go? Because there's a mismatch in values and aspirations. And that's where it's really important that you get people who are the right fit for organizations. And that's why I think it's really important to look beyond the obvious to what are people's underlying strengths, their preferences, their competencies, their personality, their sense of purpose and drive, for example, and do these align with organizations? And I think those, where I've been working, where we're really looking at these things, are much more likely to find, good people and to find this talent. I mean, we set out in our graduate program, we were looking for people, not just from countries that were underrepresented, but, countries that, were fairly low down on the development index, people from within them who were the first in their family to have gone to university, people from indigenous parts, groups of the population, people with a disability, people with a different sexual orientation. We wanted to get people who probably thought they were just never going to have a chance, probably wrongly, to come and work for us, but to actually actively reach out and give people the chance. So I think you have to have, both a recruitment strategy in the sense of a selection process that's not going to cast these people aside because you've just put some lazy criteria at the top, which weeds out, an awful lot of the population. And then to who you're appealing to, and be very explicit that people are welcome and that you're looking for them. And one of the things we did, the first thing we did as part of an end-to-end transformation of our recruitment strategy, which is still work in progress, but the very first thing we did was to sketch out a new employee value proposition. And we brought in experts to help us do that, because that's the first thing. If you don't start from that point, everything that is going to flow from it is probably going to hit, it's not going to hit the mark. So in other words, employee value proposition is just HR jargon for what's your unique selling point as an organization. And so, we say we want people to join a community of purpose. We want to offer people the opportunity to develop themselves personally and professionally, and to be part of an organization that's pushing next generation thinking. And, we spent a lot of time kind of looking into the organization as well as looking out to put that together. And I think, that's something that's, we think is unique to us in the development context. And it seems to be then resonating with people. And, it's not one, it can't possibly one size fits all, but for each organization to think about those things and then how you construct a process around that's going to actually try and get those people and explicitly signal that different talent groups are welcome. And then to make sure you don't have, as Nicky was saying, a process that's, with criteria that's going to exclude people. And I think that's what we have to do to maximize the chances, not just of getting great people, but getting the right people.
Mm. Well said. So many good nuggets there, Richard.
Yeah, I guess from the perspective of the job skills mismatch, and that triggers a lot of things with me. For one thing, I just want to focus on, I guess, industry has a big role to play also. I mean, they have to communicate, particularly in our context here, but they have to communicate to universities the skills needed, to your point earlier, Farouk. And we need to put in more mechanisms for that to happen, particularly from what we've seen here in the region. We need more of that interaction. And in a way, we need industry to sort of define what do they really want. And particularly now with this new world of work, that's probably going to be more nebulous or not. Maybe industry doesn't even know themselves, right? But it has to start with the core skills, as you said. We do see that. How do we make a better industry-driven curriculum? That's something that's something that we have to bring more to the front here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I'm stuck with this concept of complacent recruitment, which I hear as lazy recruiting. It's just the idea of just going with the typical profile we're used to, and then not really paying attention to what is necessary to get the job done and got done well. And that is a different framework for hiring that I don't see often. I see a little bit more of it now as a result of a pandemic, but I think there's a lot more to do here. And I think without it, when we have just a complacent recruitment, as you say, we open ourselves up to not hire for diversity, to miss out on lots of great talent that comes from diverse backgrounds, either based on the different schools that they've attended or the different credentials that they have, the experiences that they have, and then also their own demographics and what they can bring to the workplace. So I could see definitely that changes the dynamics. And there are a couple of questions here from Melissa and Beth. Really appreciate all of this conversation or those questions. Is what should employers look for as general skills? Certainly, specific skills depend on the different industry sectors and the companies and the organizations. But as general skills, what are the skills of the future that employers really look for in order to achieve a better match with candidates? And and then the second thing that from Beth is, do you see coming concerted effort to embrace blind hiring processes that when I see this, I imagine the show The Voice. Like, how can you hear and see the candidate's qualifications without really seeing them? Like, could we eliminate some of those aspects of the process in order to achieve better hiring and matching and more diverse hiring? Nikki?
I'm gonna definitely dive in, and I'm gonna work my way back to Melissa's question. And it's just a global point that blind hiring in some countries, certainly in Europe, many countries in Asia Pacific, have been doing blind hiring for years, and it's actually regular practice. It was supported by the UK government a number of years ago. That certainly best practice was blind hiring. So in many of the recruitment processes that we're involved in at Cappfinity, the first time the hiring manager may get to see what the candidate looks like, and I put myself in this camp, having lovingly recruited somebody with pink hair that I found had pink hair on the first day she came in the office, is that they see those people at that very final stage, and other processes, other mechanisms of screening have filtered the candidates that then the hiring manager or the assessor would be seeing actually once they're doing that one-to-one interview. In North America, many of my clients find that just unusual, maybe not quite ready for it. Some people are, some people aren't, but it is regular practice in some parts of the world. And it is amazing how many hiring managers say to me, I would never, ever have hired that person. And I have candidates walk up to me and say, I would never have got into this investment bank. I'm a female, I had caring responsibilities, I didn't have the right school, I didn't have any past experience, and here I am, thriving in this job. So it can really work, but it does take some of the traditional security, the resume aspects away from recruiters. So it's definitely a journey for people, and often piloting it, trying one part of a business where you could implement blind recruitment can be really transformational. And then to Melissa's point around the top skills, and there is study after study on this at the moment, but three kind of strengths that I would pull out. The first is the capacity to learn. So learning agility, the fact that you might be able to learn something and then learn something different because the job might change or things may be ambiguous is really key. Resilience is also, I think, particularly key with the types of jobs that people are moving into. There is less definition. You have to do things that perhaps were unexpected, and resilience is definitely up there. And then as we maybe can rely less on certainly academics for graduates currently, critical thinking, capacity to make decisions and judgments. Mm-hmm. And these skills are almost like they're a meta skill, they're a foundational skill to then build other things on top of them.
Mm-hmm.
I'll touch on the blind hiring aspect, more on the experience here where we've seen maybe not the top universities actually rise up more in the rankings of employer preference. Mm-hmm. And something we were surprised. And it was down to the less privileged, I guess, graduates were really committed and wanted to work from the get-go. And I think that's what employers wanted, right? That commitment to stay in and learn the ABCs of the actual work that they never learned in university. And we go back to the whole job skills mismatch discussion. And so that's something of interest. And I think to what Nikki was saying, there was an example where, I wouldn't consider this person because of their credentials, but now they're actively rising to the ranks in their company. So that's just one nugget we saw in terms of the statistics of employer preference in universities, and it sort of goes to the top skills. I think from this experience here, we talked about the gig economy and all that, and all the disruptions. It's still a commitment. How are us new hires committed to their new roles, or at least a commitment to learn and be in an environment that they're not experts in or they're used at? I think it's something that is preferred by many employers now.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really good. Go ahead, David.
Well, no, I was going to say Nicky stole some of the things exactly as I was going to say, so I can agree on terms of those competencies. I think she's absolutely spot on there, and I think I would add to that. Results orientation is really important. So this, the drive to actually get over the finish line with things is really important, and to be persistent in doing it. But a lot of people have good ideas. Can you actually deliver something at the end? And I think we're also starting to use some elements of blind recruiting now, and I think that's really important. And we start to build that more and more, especially at the early stages in the recruitment process, because that's when you weed out the huge numbers of people. And I think often on the basis that perhaps isn't the best one for organizations or individuals. So very important to be thinking about that. And I think there's also some challenges, frankly, for academic organizations in terms of how they're preparing people for the world of work, because simply teaching people a whole bunch of stuff that, in the rapidly changing world that we're living now, is going to be increasingly outdated. How much effort is placed. I'm not saying, absolutely not, that universities are there as a conveyor belt for industry. They have a higher purpose for sure, but I think it's really important that in that process of learning, that academic institutions more and more try to embed some of those core competencies as part of the process. And some years ago, when I was working for the EU, we did a pilot program with the university in the UK that probably wasn't top of most employers' lists, but we had a program, where the students had to learn about the EU and engage in a project which required them to use their subject, learning about the EU and the competencies that we were looking for to get the job done. Including, partnering with other people in other universities in other countries, for example. And people were then learning not just what they were supposed to be learning in their course, but they were actually learning about something else and bolstering their employability skills. And I think this is also something, one doesn't exclude the other. And I think this is going to be much more I think valuable for also as an offer, because when people are choosing which universities to go to, one of the issues that many look at because of the investment in time and money is, well, how is this going to help me in terms of employability? So I think there are challenges for everyone. They're not just for employers.
Mm-hmm. David, what advice do you have for people who want to work for an organization like the United Nations? This is a question from Tyler, and I suspect that what's behind the question is for people who want to transition from a different type of industry sector. Say me, for example, I love working my job now and working for Johns Hopkins, but if I wanted to leave higher education and join the United Nations, what recommendations do you have?
Well, you should, obviously. No, but seriously, I think people should just apply, to be honest. I mean, I was at a meeting just yesterday, bringing together colleagues across the UN. And I was meeting people I didn't know before in my own organization, and one told me that she just joined from a leading bank, and just came in and just applied for the job, for which she was qualified, and got it. And we're open to people. I mean, I'm in my first job in the UN quite late in my career, so there are more and more people who are coming in from outside, and if people think the door is shut, it's a myth. We're actively looking for different experience where we've got large parts of the organization. We're looking for people with experience of private sector finance, for example, or tech. We're really keen for those people to come. So I think people just think it's a closed door, and it's not. The door is open. Apply for things that that are relevant. I mean, the good thing is all of the jobs are published, right? We have fair selection processes that are open to everybody. And if people really look, not just apply here and there, but targeted for where something meets their area of expertise. If people are already in the workforce, just apply. And people will be given very, very serious consideration. And for people who are perhaps just not started out on their careers yet at all, I think go and get different experience. But if you're interested, for example, in an international career, go and get some international experience, whatever it is. I think it's really important that you do something outside your own bubble, your own country, your own comfort zone. And there are many opportunities, to start people's careers in NGOs or as junior professional officers sponsored by governments. We have internships, and I should say that as part of our own people strategy, we now pay a stipend to all of our interns globally. And so as a result, we now have 87% of our interns from the global south. It's very important to give a fair shot to everyone, whether we should get internships based on your ability, not your ability to pay. And so there are lots of opportunities for people to get that first experience somewhere. But certainly, if you haven't done anything internationally and you're at the start of your career, then that was something I'd really encourage people to do, to just get outside their comfort zone and go do something in another country.
Great advice, and I think that applies to people wanting to switch to any type of industry sector. This allows me to transition to a different part of this conversation, which is about the candidate. And you said something earlier, David, that the cause for mismatch from the employer side is about the skills, and there's a value proposition there that needs to be built, but there's also a value proposition that needs to be articulated from the candidate side, and it has to do with aspirations. So the employer must know what the skills necessary to do the job are in order to recruit well and to try to do it blindly, but the candidate needs to also know what their aspirations are and to try to build a pathway towards that. They don't need to know what job title they need to have in 5 or 10 years. They need to be in touch with their own aspirations, with their own areas of curiosity, with what inspires them. What does that look like moving forward in the next decade for candidates to really be more in touch with their aspirations and to work towards that? Do you have any thoughts about that, Nicky or Richard?
I have thoughts. I work for a business where our mission is strengthening the world, so I clearly have thoughts on this subject. At Cappfinity, we've had a movement for the last 17 years, and there's now a free tool on strengthsprofile.com that anyone in the world has got access to, which allows people to discover their strengths. And if you can find out what you're good at, what you find energizing, and the behaviors you want to use often, what those are, that can massively help your career search. But it can also open your eyes to behaviors and skills that you might have that have got nothing to do with your academic achievements or background. And I think often about disabled students who don't always have a vocabulary for being able to describe the things that make them strong and brilliant, and having a behavioral language, whatever that might be, strengths or another language, really helps with that. And I think about people like my son, and he won't mind me saying he's average at everything. And if you read his report, it just basically tells you that he's right in the middle, which is no help to him whatsoever. But when you stand back away from the report and you try and describe the things to him that he has, like amazing emotional intelligence, then you can really help him and guide him and get him to think about what that might mean from a career. So for me, it's very much about helping candidates in all walks of life understand the gifts that they have that are unique to them, that employers will absolutely want to, recruit on the basis of, but it's helping students where, unless they've met people like yourself, Farouk, in, enlightened career centres, it's helping them realize there's so much more than what they did at school or their academics or what's happened to them to date. And the more that we can try to really help people at a very young age connect with those things, then I think we've got a real chance at having great workforces in the future. But if we're only defined by our last job or our past academics, then that's very sad, because there is so much more that everyone has to offer. And that's veterans, that's offenders, that's the global workforce, in my view.
What's the employer reception to those types of strength-based profiles? So you're wanting the candidates to take them and to get to know themselves, but do you find that the employer on the other side are ready for that and are receiving it and using it as much as you would want?
Where we would always kind of suggest understanding your strengths goes is in preparation. Use it to guide your career search, use it to support evidence into an interview question. And what we know is that students, particularly diverse students, who take things like strengths profile, it's essentially working on self-insight, they're 50% more likely to get through a final stage interview. So what it means for the employer is essentially the candidate is better prepared, but they can talk about the things that they're passionate about. And that is often the bit that we don't teach, you don't learn about. It really just helps with people describe the things that they have to offer that might not be about their course or their academics.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. Well, what about you, Richard? What do you think about this?
No, it's a great comments there, Nicky, and it's particularly in the Philippines where we saw that the family actually impacts or affects how a student selects their career, and so maybe that process about understanding what their true aspirations are isn't really fully developed or explored. So that's something we're working on the career centers, right, Farouk? And how can you bring that guidance even in the sophomore year? Because we're sort of battling that cultural norm of having family decide, or at least putting the first step of where you should be working. So those are great thoughts, and it's something we wish to sort of expand and do more here.
Mm-hmm.
That process.
Absolutely. Nicky, Richard, and David, I can't believe we're at the end of the hour. Where did the hour go? This was a fascinating conversation. I always ask this question at the end of Vision Chats, and I swear to the audience I didn't prepare our guests today for it. A word, a phrase, or an image that describes the future for you. Who would like to go first?
Scary.
All right.
Not very positive, but maybe it's this. I don't. Yeah, it's, I guess, being comfortable with the threats that you see out there. I think that's.
Yeah. Well, and scary is the first thought that came to mind, to your mind and to the minds of a lot of other people. So I'll take it. And there's a lot of uncertainty out there, but we're about to be exposed to or to experience. So I really appreciate the candor there. How about you, David or Nicky?
A couple of things. I mean, I absolutely get where Richard's coming from. I like this phrase VUCA a lot: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, which kind of, in some senses, sums up where we are. But ultimately, there are huge challenges. But I think have there ever been so many opportunities? For people. If the world's in a difficult place, we need people who are going to rise to the challenge, and that's the next generation as well. So, it's opportunities as well. And I'd say in terms of a picture, it's not painted, is it? Thank goodness, That's right. And so we need people to go and design it, to imagine it and start to paint it, hopefully in a better way than my generation is seemingly leaving things. But, yes, things are scary. And, I think there's been there's times where they've been scarier, to be honest. Not saying downplaying what we have now, but there are also tremendous opportunities, and it's also a time of tremendous progress and technological advances that are opening up huge opportunities. So I think it's this mix of scary and exciting at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I love it. It's up to us. That's what you're saying. And it's not painted. It's up to us. Nicky, you get the last word.
I've got 3 words, which is, if you find it scary, invest in emotional resource. 4 words, because that will help.
Wonderful, beautiful. That's really awesome, Nicky. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to all 3 of you and the insights you brought to today's Vision Chat. This was a fascinating conversation. I learned a lot from all of you, so I really appreciate it. My gratitude to the audience for joining us again for another exciting Vision Chat. And as I always say, the only vision that matters is the one that you create. Thank you all so much, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.